Hi there, Brian Amron with Value Driven Analytics here, coming to you with 4 tips to lower the risk of making attention to detail errors. And this is a very important topic for analysts, perhaps an underrated topic. If you watched our communication training video, one of the things I mentioned was that executives generally trust analysts unless they do something to violate that trust. And when they do, when we maybe don't check our work and we present something that's inaccurate or not based on a rigorous methodology, not only does your reputation get impacted where an executive or stakeholders won't trust your work as much in the future, but sometimes it can actually impact all analysts at the organization. And all of a sudden, stakeholders are afraid to make data-driven decisions. They're asking themselves, what if there was an error in the analysis? What if something's wrong here? Data-driven decision-making, analytics in general, is all about helping an organization make better decisions with analytics. But sometimes if an analysis isn't done properly, or it's based on inaccurate data, it could actually lead to a worse decision. So it's extremely important to have a high level of attention to detail. So today we're going to talk about 4 ways that you can lower the risk of making attention to detail errors. The first method is to double check your work. That applies to anything, right? Especially when checking for duplicates in your analysis. We'll talk more about that. Double check your work. Second item we'll talk about is sanity checking your work, or applying validation checks. We'll talk more about what those are. Third thing that you can do is to compare your results and your numbers to an existing analysis or dashboard that has similar data, make sure they generally line up. And the last thing is to do peer review. Show your work to someone else, have them check over, and maybe they can look for those same kind of things that you were. Sometimes a second set of eyes just sees things differently. All right, so let's dive into number 1, double check your work. If you're doing any kind of coding, a dashboarding tool, maybe you're working in Excel, double check your work, your calculations, your methodology, your formulas, your code. Just go through it a second, or maybe if it's a really important analysis or model, maybe you even do it 3 or 4 times, especially if you've had attention to detail issues in the past. Double check your work. Now, in particular, I would encourage you to look out for duplication issues. This is so common, especially in SQL, but it can come up in coding platforms. It could probably come up even if you're working in Excel or a dashboarding platform, where maybe you join tables together in a certain way and there become duplicates as a result of that. One thing I look for, especially in my SQL queries, is I always want to make sure I understand and validate what one row represents in a data set. And if you're joining to a table, you want to join generally what one row represents in that table. So if you're joining to a product table, and it's 1 row per product key, you want to join on product key. Most of the time, there's always exceptions, but that's a good practice to have to avoid duplicate issues. Now, you might have a product table that you think is 1 row per product key, and what you can do is select the count of all rows and the count distinct of whatever you think it's 1 row per maybe product key. And if the count of rows and the count distinct of whatever you think it's unique on, product key in this case, if those 2 numbers are the same, guess what? You've got a table that's been validated to be 1 row per product key. But if they're not, if maybe you had fewer unique product keys than you did rows, it tells you there's some duplicates, and you need to either handle those, look further into it. There's going to be an issue if you join on product key. You may end up with some duplicates. So double check your work and look especially for duplicate issues by always knowing when you're joining tables together what 1 row represents in that table. Validate that that's the case. Okay, so you've double checked your work. The next thing when you're looking at the results is to sanity check your work, or apply some validation checks. Basically, you're asking, would a reasonable person look at this data and be surprised? Now, just because maybe they would be surprised doesn't mean it's wrong. In fact, that's why we do the analysis. Finding some really surprising insights is a great thing potentially, but if it's really surprising, it could mean that maybe there was an error along the way. And so if you do see something that just doesn't make sense or it's really surprising, go back to step one and apply maybe a triple check or a quadruple check. You really need to be confident that that's the case before you automatically go and present this surprising finding. Sometimes we'll get really excited and we'll want to tell everybody, and then we look further into it and say, oh, actually made a mistake there. Remember that insight that I told you about? That was actually a coding error. Nobody wants that. So double check, triple check, quadruple your check before you present something that's really surprising. Now, when you're doing those validation checks, you're probably, one, just thinking, does it make sense at all? If I saw a time series and there's a particular period where sales were like 10 times higher they were in any other time period, it's possible that was the case. Maybe something surprising happened. Now, if you've been at that company for a while, you probably would have heard about that and said, oh yeah, that was that time period. That makes sense. I can explain that. But if you weren't, you look at that and say, that seems a little odd. Let me just look at my code and make sure I didn't make a mistake. Maybe I'll talk to some other people at the company and see if they can identify a reason for that. But I need to look further into that if I can't explain that based on my history. Another thing that you can do, it doesn't even have to stand out like that, 10 times higher sales in a particular time period. It could just be maybe you're looking at an analysis of sales and you see that sales have been going down, but you know from prior analyses and talking to people that, wait a minute, sales have been good over the last year. Why am I seeing that sales are down here? It just doesn't line up with my history. Let me do a triple check or a quadruple check. And that goes into our next validation technique, which is comparing to other sources of the same data. If you're pulling sales, for instance, a trending of sales, there's probably another dashboard out there that has a trend of sales. So check for a particular time period, maybe a few time periods, and in some cases, if the sales should be the exact same, check for that. And if they're not, look into why that's not the case. Now, sometimes you might be doing an analysis that's filtered down to a particular geography or business segment. And so you may say, well, this dashboard over here, it's got sales, but I can't maybe it doesn't have the filters to break it down by that same geography or business segment that you're looking at for your analysis. So you may say, well, I guess I can't compare them. No, one thing you might be able to do is, say your analysis is based on a SQL query. You might be able to just run your SQL query with something filtered out, maybe that where statement that's filtering it down to a certain geography. You just quickly comment that out, rerun your analysis or run the query, and now make sure that, okay, now that I've removed that, I'm pulling all sales, does that line up to this other dashboard that has all sales? And if you validated that it equals each other and that they're the same in that case, now if you relax that where statement, the only thing that could go wrong to throw off your analysis is that single where statement that you're relaxing. So all that to say, if you've got a dashboard that maybe has sales at a high level, maybe you can relax certain parts of your analysis, make sure it ties out, and then feel really good. You might apply triple, quadruple checks to the part that you're now uncommenting out to customize for the analysis that you're running. So check against other sources. And finally, after you've done that, maybe you don't have the time to do this for every case, but especially if it's something that's going to drive a major decision, or if through the process of applying validation checks, the sanity checks, something was really surprising. Either one of those, important analysis or something is surprising, definitely makes sense to do some peer review. Peer review just means to find a peer, an analytics colleague, maybe on your team or another analytics team at your organization, and set up some quick time. Maybe you don't even need to meet. You could just send them and say, can you take a look at this? Does anything seem off to you? Some cases you might just show them the results. In other cases you might even have them look at your code, but they're reviewing it and giving you feedback. Now what's neat about this is, so far the checks we've talked about really focus on the accuracy of the data. But with a peer review, they can look into and double check your code and your accuracy of the data. Maybe they'll apply some of the same checks that you've already done from another person's perspective. They can also give you feedback on the methodology. Maybe the whole setup of the analysis, there's a flaw in it. Maybe there's something you need to control for that you haven't. And so another person could look at that and give you some advice and say, you might want to control for this. So peer reviews can be great to make sure your analysis is right, and there's one or two other benefits that come through that peer review process. In addition to things like networking with each other and getting to know your teammates can also come out of that. But also, the person whose work is being peer reviewed is getting feedback, and that might help them even in the future to put together a more robust analysis. They're learning through that process. In fact, peer review may be one of the best ways to improve an analytics methodology by getting feedback on how another analyst would address that. And on the flip side, maybe the person who's peer reviewing doesn't find anything in the analysis, but perhaps in the process, they learned a new technique from you, the person whose work was being peer reviewed. And so that peer reviewer is actually learning through that process, and they might be able to take the technique you used in the analysis being peer reviewed and apply it to a future analysis. So there's all kinds of benefits of using peer review in the validation process. So those are 4 techniques for you. Start off with some double checking, triple checking, apply some sanity checks or some validation checks, compare it against another dashboard with the same data, and the last thing you might do, if it's a really important analysis or there's some surprising findings, is apply peer review. Have someone else take a look. Now, you might ask, if I follow all those steps, can you guarantee me, Brian, that I'll never make an attention to detail issue or a mistake? No, I can't. Everybody has made attention to detail errors. I've made them, unfortunately. But I realize how important it is not to make those, or to make them as few times as possible. And so I want to do everything I can to lower the risk of that. So when I think about attention to detail issues and look back on how often I experience them, I would say if you can go a whole year with maybe 0, 1, maybe 2 attention to detail issues, that especially ones that aren't impacting a major decision, they don't really change the decision that would have been made, but maybe a number is off in an analysis and someone flags that, that's not too bad. In fact, I'd say that's generally pretty good for an analyst. It means that you're probably doing some double checking and some validation checks and all the different techniques we've applied. Now, if you're looking at more like 2 or 3, maybe 4, I'd say that's about average for an analyst. I wouldn't say you're particularly great at validating your work, but I also wouldn't say you're the worst. You're probably about average. Now, when you get into 4, 5, maybe 6 attention detail issues or more, that's a problem. That's really something you need to focus on, and it's starting to get to the point where your reputation might be at stake, where analysts or stakeholders and executives, they may start to be doubting your work, and it could become a performance issue. So don't let it get to that. It's very likely that if you are making 4, 5, or 6 attention to detail issues in a year, that you're not applying these techniques. And so no matter what, you want to be applying these validation techniques. Take it very seriously for your reputation and others to make sure your work is in a good shape. Now, I have seen the other end of the spectrum where an analyst is very diligent, which is a great thing, but maybe they apply so many checks and it gets to a point where it impacts their efficiency. We have a whole training on efficiency. It's important to check your work, don't get me wrong, but periodically an analyst should take a step back, think about all the checks that they applied. So I gave you 4 today, and an analyst might come up with others, but always take a step back and assess them and think, how often does this check that I perform every time, let me think about how long it takes me, and let me also think about how often it has helped me identify an error. So you're assessing that periodically, And if there's a check that you're consistently performing, especially one that takes a long time to perform, and you think back and you think, you know, that has never actually helped me detect an error, you might think about not doing that in the future. Relaxing it. Maybe doing it in a very, very, very critical situation, an important analysis or a really surprising insight comes about. Maybe then those checks come into play, but not every time. Versus if you reflect on a check and you think, wow, this check, it has really saved me in a lot of times. I almost sent out some bad data and I did that check, and it's been several times, I would have sent out bad data if I hadn't ran that check. Wow, by all means, keep running that check. That is an efficient check. So assess the usefulness of your checks by how long they take to some extent, but even more importantly, do these checks actually help you flag errors? And if they do, keep running them. I hope that's helpful. Hopefully you understand how important attention to detail is, and I hope to see you in the next video. I want to thank you for watching today. I hope you got a lot out of it. And if you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. Now, if you have any questions about what we covered, please consider leaving a comment and I'll try to respond to it as soon as I can. One last thing, if you or your organization ever need anything analytics related, an analysis, a dashboard build, maybe a data science model build, perhaps deeper training on this very topic or other analytics topics, even a complete analytics transformation, please consider value-driven analytics. Check out our site at valuedrivenanalytics.com, and if it resonates with you, give us a call. We'd love to help you out.